Hello, and thank you for joining me for this webinar on data in comprehensive school counseling programs. I hope that just saying that much hasn't scared anyone away. I know that data is not always everyone's favorite thing to talk about or favorite thing to do in school counseling, but I hope that you will bear with me. Strap in, hold on tight, and we will get through this together. For those of you who I have not had the opportunity to meet, I am Sarah Kirk. I'm the school counselor specialist at the Oklahoma State Department of Education. I am passionate about school counseling, and I'm really just grateful that you are here and wanting to learn more about comprehensive school counseling. I work for the Student Support Office at the OSDE, and our mission is to serve schools, families, and students, and of course, school counselors as well. So today's presentation, like I said, we're going to be diving into data. Ooh, I love a good alliteration. So data is, like I said, a little bit overwhelming to some people. So we are going to try to go through this in a way that makes sense and that is not too overwhelming. So we'll talk about how it fits into the ASCA National Model. We'll talk about data-informed school counseling, different types of data. There's that alliteration again. We'll dig into some specifics about data. We'll look at the school data summary, which is included in the national model and that template. Then we'll talk about implementation, reflection, and summary. Now, I want to give a quick, heads up, I guess, as we get started, because data is one of those topics that we could talk about for a week. We could have a week-long professional development and never cover it all, right? So data is not a real easy one-time 45-minute webinar like I'm trying to do right now. So we know we won't be able to learn it all today. Today is really meant to be a brief introduction to what data looks like in comprehensive school counseling. And then we can dive deeper at another time into really that implementation piece. We are going to talk about implementation a little bit, but today is really meant to give you that overview of what this looks like. There's also a lot of great resources out there that, again, allow for a lot deeper of a understanding of data. I really recommend the ASCA U Data Specialist course. I did that I think about 4 years ago now, before I was applying for RAMP, and it was a game changer. So those ASCA U's, if you're not familiar, they're self-paced trainings, professional developments. They include reading articles, watching webinars, reading books, different components. But it is a really, really great way to get a better understanding of data. A couple of other really great resources. Of course, the National Model book is great. This implementation guide that goes with the 4th edition has a lot of information about data that I was just looking over today and was really amazed by some of the ideas and suggestions that has. So definitely check that out. And then the Making Data Workbook by ASCA, another big time game changer. That's included in the Data Specialist ASCA U. So if you do that, you will buy that book, and that's a part of it. But I really, really recommend those extra opportunities to learn more than we'll be able to today. But I'm definitely glad you're here, because this is a good first step. Or if this isn't your first step, if you're familiar with data, this might be a really good just catch up, reminder, and just to really get you set on the right path as you move forward in your comprehensive school counseling program. All right, as always, we're not going to let perfect be the enemy of good. Again, with data, that is very possible. I hear a lot of school counselors say data scares them, so they stay away from all data. But one takeaway that I really hope you get today is that data is so connected to everything we do as a school counselor that there are pieces and elements that we can do right away that include data. Not all of it has to be the big, scary kind you learned about in graduate school that seemed super overwhelming, right? Data really does touch on all aspects of comprehensive school counseling. So don't think that you have to do it all to do some. Like we always say, each step towards comprehensive school counseling and the national model is what's best for our kids. We're not going to do it all overnight. It's not meant to be done that way. It's meant to be done step by step, and we will learn some of those great steps to take today. All right, so let's talk about how the national model and data fit together. I've already mentioned it a couple of times, and I'll mention it many more, I'm sure, but really data fits into every aspect of the ASCA National Model. Data is ongoing. Data is not one of those checkmark items. If you've joined me for some of these other webinars, maybe something like the use of time calculator was a little bit of a check mark. Maybe you do it once in the fall and once in the spring, and you share it with your stakeholders, and that's really the end of that piece of the national model. Some of the elements of the national model are like that. Data is not. Data is really meant to be ongoing. Data is meant to be an integrated part of comprehensive school counseling. It's not a standalone item. So as we talk about how it fits into the ASCA National Model, I think you'll understand that. Just as a friendly reminder, our ASCA National Model is made up of those 4 components: define, manage, deliver, and assess. And each of those components come together to outline what comprehensive school counseling should look like that results in a positive impact on our students, which of course is our end goal. When we implement a comprehensive school counseling program based on the ASCA National Model, we have a lot better outcomes. And that's because our decisions are based on data. We're serving all students. We're including developmentally appropriate curriculum. We're closing achievement and opportunity gaps. And all of that results in those improved student achievement, attendance, and discipline. So that is the important piece of this. That's the why behind all of this. And you'll see there that very first line on this slide that I always remind us of as we're talking about these components talks about data-informed decision-making, because truly comprehensive school counseling is data-informed. That's why it touches all parts of the national model. So you'll see here that I highlighted, as I always do, where today's presentation fits. So we're still in that manage component. That's that behind the scenes work to help guide and design and to get ready to implement our school counseling program. So the school data summary, which we'll talk about today, falls under that manage component. You'll see it again highlighted here. We talk about the different elements of the manage component, and the school data summary is one of them. However, you'll now see on this slide that I truly believe what we're talking about today fits in every component of the national model. Yes, that school data summary is right there, but every other piece is somehow touching on data or driven by data or using data. So when we think about data, I really hope you're starting to see how all of these pieces connect. That's what the national model is meant to do. If you've joined me on some of these webinars, you know that we're taking bite-sized chunks and really trying to digest each one individually. But I hope that you're seeing that they're really not standalone items. They're really connected. We're making them standalone so that we can understand them and process them and get them in place, but they're really, really connected. As we talk about data today, of course, that's going to tie back to our beliefs, vision, and mission. It's going to guide our goals, and as our goals guide our action plans and our lesson plans. So all of this is connected. And of course, when you think about that 4th component, the assess component, well, that's all data. We're assessing by looking at data and seeing what's working, what's not, where do we need to improve, what do we need to change, all of that. So there's just data entrenched into all of this. You can see here, I love this image. This is from the Making Data Workbook that I mentioned. Again, highly, highly, highly recommend. But this image talks about how and why school counselors use data. So you'll see here, again, a lot of those components of the national model. So you'll see where it talks about that school counseling vision and mission and those outcome goals and the evidence-based interventions, and then that progress monitoring, and then assessing, advocating and leading, and then the systemic change. So those are all elements of the national model, and all of them involve data. So let's talk about what data-informed school counseling is. When we say that we want to be data-informed school counselors, what that means is that we have a school counseling program that's focus and direction are based on student needs through a review of student and school data. So we are in making our decisions, focusing and making our direction based on school data. That's such an important piece of this. I hope that you can hear that loud and clear, that our entire focus and direction of our school counseling program is determined by data. When we don't do that, when we leave that step out, we might be well-intentioned, but we're not doing what's best for kids because we're not making our decisions based on what they need. Okay, we always give the example of, we don't always, I will share an example I've heard that I loved. In a webinar last year, I heard the presenter talking about giving out shoes. If you were to go to your school and give out shoes to every student in a size 8, would that be effective? No, because not every student needs size 8 shoes, right? So we aren't making our decisions based on data when we do that. There's also an equity piece to that, but that's a whole different conversation. But we want to give students the services they need based on their needs, not because we just want to give it to everybody. So if we create our classroom counseling instruction based on just topics we think are fun to talk about, we don't know that that's what our students need. If we put people into small groups just because we don't know that that's what they need, we're giving them size 8 shoes when maybe they wear a size 5, they have a different need. So making sure we review that data in order to really meet the needs of our students. And of course, data-informed, I almost said trauma-informed, data-informed school counseling also means that we use that, we understand and we use that data to ensure that equitable services, right? So these pieces connect a lot, that we want to make sure the services are equitable so that every student receives the benefits of the school counseling program and the benefits they need. So we want to not leave any students out, but we also want to meet their specific needs, not the needs of what we think the general population needs. We know that when we implement school counseling programs that aren't based on data and are based on what we think student needs, we're using our cultural lens to decide. So if I, as a white 33-year-old female, decide everything that my students need without using data, I am going to miss a lot because I only have the lens of a white female. And I only have the lens of a white middle-class female who grew up in a 2-parent household in suburban Oklahoma. So you can see, you know, my focus, my understanding is narrow. I try to expand it, but just inevitably it's narrow. So that's when data comes in. It widens our focus. It gives us appropriate direction. So I love these 2 terms we're going to talk about here, but I want to give a disclaimer before I dive into it. The words don't matter, at least not to me. This is not a test. I'm not going to quiz you on what a data-informed school counselor is versus a data-responsive school counselor. But I want you to understand the differences in these two elements, these two descriptions, because it helps us understand what type of data we're supposed to be looking at as comprehensive school counselors. So when we think about a data-informed school counselor, we're reviewing data to reveal trends across grades or years, inequities in student achievement, opportunity or attainment, and student needs revealed by changes such as school attendance, disciplinary problems, or academic performance. So the key there is revealing those trends that might show us that there is a need. So we're looking at school data to see what's going on here, right? So that might be looking at fourth grade discipline data and noticing that one class has significantly more discipline referrals than the other 3 fourth grade classes or something like that. We're being data informed. We're looking at our data. We're revealing trends. And then, of course, we can put something in place, but let's pause there. We aren't going to get to that part quite yet. But then let's talk about that data responsive school counselor, because then that data responsive school counselor further uses the data to determine if the school counseling program, strategies, interventions, and activities are effective and use those to make future decisions about our practices. So let me extend my example. So we've got the 1 fourth grade class with more discipline referrals. So we sit down as a team and we put a couple of different interventions, activities, and strategies in place. Maybe one of them is that I collaborate with the teacher. I talk with the teacher about what's going on and give the teacher some ideas of things to implement in the classroom. Maybe I go in and teach a classroom instruction lesson on, I don't know, whatever caveat, but I would have wanted to look into the data even deeper to see what the discipline problems were. So if they were all, or a lot of them were off-task behavior, then I could go in and do a lesson about on-task behavior, what that looks like and that sort of thing. So I could do that, or maybe even a unit, because this is a need and we want to make sure we're really meeting this need. So we've got a unit of classroom instruction. We've got some collaboration with the teacher. Maybe we've got the principal doing an observation. And then I implement a small group for some of the students who have even higher numbers of discipline problems or discipline referrals in that class. Okay, so we've looked at the data. We were data informed. By looking at the data, we revealed a trend. We then wanted to do something about it. So we're being data responsive because I'm now going to track my data of each of those interventions. So that unit that I do, I'm going to do a pre-test and a post-test, and I'm going to look at the number of discipline referrals before I start that unit and after. I'm going to collect data as a part of that unit and as a part of that small group as well. So now I'm not only using data to inform my decisions, but I'm being data responsive because I know that if I do that small group and discipline referrals just continue to go up, okay, that wasn't an effective intervention in this situation. What else can we do? Why wasn't that effective? You know, that again is helping me better understand our strategies and interventions. So again, not going to quiz you on knowing the difference because I kind of have a hard time remembering which is data informed, which is data responsive. I don't think it matters. It's data that informs school counseling, right? All of this does. But I find if I was with all of you all in person, I would ask you which of these two you're most comfortable with. And what I find when I present on this is that most people are more comfortable with one or the other. It's not always the same one, which is interesting, but it's either one or the other. And we really, to be True data-informed school counseling programs, we want both. We want to see both of those elements, and we'll talk more about what that looks like as we go on. All right, so when we use data, it helps us monitor student progress, identify students who are having difficulties or discipline problems. It identifies barriers to learning, helps us understand the factors that are affecting student behavior. It helps us to identify and access and equity issues, which I love that about data. I think those are the things that we don't see without digging into data. Closing those achievement, opportunity, and attainment gaps, access the effectiveness of school counseling program activities. That's that second piece we were just talking about. Improve, modify, or change services provided to students, and then educate stakeholders about the power of a school counseling program. So it's that advocacy piece, which is so important. So you can see this list is really a big part of school counseling, right? I mean, if you look at this, you could change the heading on this, and this could be like School Counseling 101, right? This is what we do. We want to identify barriers. We want to find where access and equity issues are happening and then close them. We want to make sure stakeholders understand how important we are. This is school counseling. So let's talk a little bit more about the types of data. Kind of done that brief overview, how it fits into the model, what trauma-informed, I keep saying that, what data-informed school counseling looks like. I guess it would be trauma-informed as well, because we're making sure to meet the needs of our students who have experienced trauma, but not what I'm meaning to say. But now let's talk about the types of data so that we can really understand what this looks like in action. I think this part helps us start putting it into place. So hopefully it does for you too. All right, let's dive in. So our types of data, we have 3 types of data. We want data to define the who, what, and why of our work with students. So the who, we call that participation data. That is how many students are participating and how often they are participating and for what length of time. Quite honestly, this is the easiest type of data. We all have this type of data, okay? So if you were feeling overwhelmed, if you thought, oh, I can't do any of this, I promise you, you can do participation data. You probably already are. If you've run a small group before and you have a list of the 6 students who were in that small group, the dates the small group occurred, and how long the small group lasted, guess what? You've got participation data. So you've already got that. That's just the who. Now, the next type of data is the what. So those are the attitudes, knowledge, and skills as identified by the ASCA mindsets and behaviors that is taught to students. We call this mindsets and behaviors data. That sounds a little confusing, but we're going to dive deeper into it in a minute. I also want to pause right here and remind you, if you're not familiar with the ASCA mindsets and behaviors, please check out that webinar if you have not already, so that you better understand what those are. We're not going to dive into that right here, but you do want to have a good understanding of that in order to understand how to collect this mindsets and behaviors data. All right, so I really like to think of the mindsets and behavior data as what our students are learning as a result of our school counseling program. And again, we'll dive deeper in just a second. But let's go over that third type just briefly, the why. So this is what's called outcome data. This is the holy grail of data. Everybody wants outcome data. It's the really good stuff. It's the hardest to collect, but it is the most meaningful. It is the best for that advocacy piece when we want to show people why we matter. Outcome data is amazing. Not to mention, that we want to see those positive student outcomes. That's why we're here. And we know we impact students. We know we influence their outcomes, but we need the data to show it, right? We've got to have some proof. So the why is the impact of our school counseling services, our direct student services, which includes instruction, appraisal and advisement, and counseling. Again, if that's not familiar with you, check out the webinar on direct student services. But we want to know the impact of those direct student services on student achievement, attendance, and discipline. You'll hear those three repeated over and over because those are the three big buckets in education that we want to see students improve. We want to see their achievement improve. That's why we're in school. If they're not in school, if their attendance needs improvement, then of course we know they can't learn. And we always know that discipline interferes with our education too. So those are those three big bucket items. All right, so let's dive a little deeper into each of those now. So starting with participation data, again, this is our easiest one. This is that one that answers who participated in what activities, how many students, how much time, and how many sessions. So here's a couple examples. I think this one's pretty easy to understand, but just to help you wrap your head around it. 8 fourth grade students participated in study skills sessions that met 6 times for 45 minutes. Participation data. Now, when I say outcome data is the best data for advocacy, I don't mean that this isn't great too. You can post this on your website. You can put this in your newsletter. You can post this on a bulletin board. This is good stuff too, because it shows that you are getting that face-to-face time with students and putting programs in place to help them to be successful. Not everyone understands that about our job. So this is not to be left out. It's just that outcome data is the real fancy stuff. But this is important too. We wouldn't talk about it if it wasn't. So then that next one, 243 of 250 sixth grade students participated in 3 career awareness lessons. 6 of the 7 students who were absent for initial lessons participated in makeup sessions. I love that example because it touches on how you made up the lessons for the students who were absent. What that one is missing is how much time was devoted. So I wish that one said how long each of those 3 lessons were. And then that last example, 450 ninth graders completed an individual learning plan. Same with that one. I wish that there was some sort of time tied to it, but that's okay. It's still a good example. It still shows how beneficial your school counseling program is and how many people are participating in activities as a part of your school counseling program, which is great. All right, let's jump over to the mindsets and behavior data. This is the one that we said can be a little bit confusing, I think. So let's walk through this a little bit slowly. This is the one that is answering the questions, what did students learn through participation in school counseling activities? So again, this is where everything starts connecting. We have our mindsets and behaviors. That is in our first section of the national model in our define component. So we use those mindsets and behaviors to define our school counseling program. We then align those mindsets and behaviors with our action plans and our lesson plans. So when we are implementing student services, we want to have our mindsets and behaviors connected to those. So if I'm doing a lesson on self-esteem, I need to be able to say which mindset and behavior I am trying to meet by implementing that lesson on self-esteem. So then what the mindsets and behavior data does is it looks at if students learned what they needed to learn through that activity. So the self-esteem example, did students' self-esteem improve as a result of the unit of school counseling instruction lessons I did on self-esteem? That's what our mindsets and behavior data tells us. So we've got that participation data that tells us who participated. Mindsets and behaviors data What did the students learn? And then the outcome data is like, how did they apply that? Okay. So let's give a different example. If I'm doing a small group on self-control with a group of students, let's do pre-K students, because self-control groups with pre-K students is always interesting. So let's say I had a group of pre-K students who needed some extra time practicing self-control skills. So I put them in a small group on self-control. Now, my participation data would tell me how many of those pre-Kers were in the group, how many sessions we had, and for how long. Now, our mindsets and behaviors data would look at the students before the group. Maybe I would collect this through a pretest. And then it would look at the students after the group. Again, maybe using a post-test. So it'd be looking at what students learned about self-control through that small group. That would be my mindsets and behaviors data. Let's take it one step further. I would also look at discipline referrals before my group and discipline referrals for several months following the group. That would be my outcome data. How did they use what they learned out in the real world, out in the pre-K world, and have a more positive outcome in the school setting as a result of my school counseling activity? I'm going to pause. I'm going to take a drink of coffee. You take one too. It can be a lot, but I hope that makes sense. It's really raining in Oklahoma right now. And so maybe if you can hear that, it's a little bit calming. It's like a mindful moment. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. I hope you're starting to understand how these three types of data work. Like I said, that mindsets and behavior data can be collected before and after an activity or intervention through tools that measure change. So it could be questions or prompts based on the content delivered. So that's, again, kind of like that pre-test, post-test thing. Okay, so let's look at some examples. This is from the ASCA National Model. These examples, they break it up into mindsets and behaviors. You don't have to do that though. It's all mindsets and behaviors data. But the first examples just refer back to the mindsets part of the mindsets and behaviors. So, okay, so 75% of 8th grade students report they can play a sport and complete homework on time. So you might notice that is the student's perception of that. Some people call this type of data perception data, because the 8th grade students they're looking into themselves and perceiving, yeah, I can play a sport and complete my homework on time. Now, this isn't outcome data because we don't know that they are completing their homework and playing a sport. We don't know for sure. It's what they're reporting. Okay, so keep that in mind. That's also one of the reasons why that outcome data is the cream of the crop, the gold standard, because it actually measures the student outcome. I think perception, mindset, and behavior data is so important, but we just have to see it through the lens of this is their perceptions. This is their beliefs. If you just kind of scroll through that list there, you see believe, report, believe, willing to engage, that sort of thing, especially in those mindsets. The behaviors, it gets a little more concrete, which is great. And I love that. So let's look at some of the behavior examples. 88% of 4th graders can write a goal using the SMART format. Perfect example of a mindsets and behaviors data. Now let's talk about this one. I actually gave this example in a different webinar, but if you heard that one, you get to hear it again. So if I was doing a lesson on SMART goals, I might end that lesson with having each 4th grade student write a SMART goal and turn it into me, or just leave it on their table so that I can look at them. That's how I could collect that mindsets and behaviors data, because I could go through and see what percentage of them did it correctly. That's probably how that example was collected. That data was collected. It doesn't always have to be a pre or post test. It can be a result of your lesson. I remember which webinar I was talking about that, the lesson plans webinar, which is great. And if you're not familiar with that, please check that one out. Let's see, I'll talk about the last one too. So the last one on this example of behavior data says 90% of sixth graders can describe upstander behavior. So what I'm guessing is this one was a unit on bullying prevention. And they did something to collect, maybe it was a post-test, they did something to collect data on if students could describe what an upstander was. And as a result of the unit on bullying prevention, 90% of sixth graders could. Perfect. Another way to deepen this data a little bit would be if you gave your pretest data. Maybe you gave those sixth graders a pretest asking them what an upstander was, and only 20% knew. Then you could say, as a result of your program, 70% of students increased or improved, or whatever word you want to use there. All right, let's keep going. All right, outcome data. We've already talked about this. This is that how did the learning affect? So what was the longer term effects of student achievement, attendance, and discipline as a result of your school counseling intervention activity, something in your program? So we want to make sure that this type of data tells us, because we implemented this, blank happened. It's not always going to say that, well, let me back up. Outcome data cannot infer causation, because we don't know for a fact that only our intervention impacted that. But outcome can look at the student previously and after and give us that really rich data. So it's not experimental. Keep that in mind for all my data people out there who I don't want saying you can't infer causation, because I understand that. But outcome data does answer that question. How did what they learned affect students' achievement, attendance, or discipline? So let's look at some examples of that, or some ways to collect that, because I always get this question: how do I collect outcome data? I'm at the elementary school. Or how do I collect outcome data? I'm at the high school. So let's look at this. So at elementary school, things like promotion rates, reading levels, standardized tests, numbers of days absence, discipline referrals, loss of instructional minutes, those sorts of things. I would even dive deeper, because some of my best outcome data was really specific. And we'll talk more about that as we dive into goal setting and some of those other pieces of the national model. But for example, I did a closing the gap plan once that looked at discipline referrals of kindergarten students who did not go to pre-K. So it was really specific, but we were able to look at some outcome data as a result of putting interventions and supports and activities in place for that specific group. So this list is really broad, but you can think more specific as well. Middle school, again, those discipline referrals, standardized tests, number of days absent. But then in middle school, you also start getting things like GPA, failure rate. Different districts and schools do different things for that, but you could start looking at some of those elements as well. And same with high school, except now we've got credits, got on track for graduation, graduation rate, dropout rate, all those sorts of elements as well. But again, with all grades, we can really dive deep into specific student groups within each of these sources. All right, this is just a little chart I had made. This is included in our comprehensive school counseling framework for Oklahoma, but this just summarizes everything we just talked about. So I'm not going to read this to you, but you can see here those 3 different types. I did want to point out there's a 4th row down there that includes supplemental data. So this might be like your needs assessment, universal screeners, school safety and climate surveys, those types of things. They give you additional data, but it's not how we want to guide our school counseling program. I won't dive too deep into this because I know school counselors love their needs assessments. But keep in mind that a needs assessment is really only considered supplemental data. It really should only be included on top, or not even on top of, in addition to the participation, mindsets, and behaviors and outcomes. And the reason for that is because needs assessments are really only telling us the perceptions of some. We know that when we use needs assessments, we typically only hear from specific groups. We don't often hear from a representative population, a diverse sample. And so that can really skew what our results tell us. We also know that we won't always get truthful answers when we ask caregivers and staff and students on a needs assessment what they need. What tells us more accurate data is that school data, right? When we pull that school data and look at what's happening within our walls, that gives us much more accurate information than what a needs assessment can. I will admit, I was a very, very, very big fan of needs assessments. In fact, you probably could have asked me 5 or 6 years ago if I collect data, and my answer would have been yes, I use needs assessments. So I'm guilty, and I think they're great. I think they're really helpful. In fact, I'm working on a needs assessment for all Oklahoma schools right now, and it's important to me. But we just have to be careful, because if we design our entire comprehensive school counseling program based on needs assessment data, we are not being equitable. And if you do collect needs assessment data, I really urge you to collect demographic information with that. Collect the race of the person completing it, free or reduced lunch status, special education status, if possible, those types of things. Because then when you look at the data, if those demographics don't reflect your school population, it should be thrown out. If you have 55% Hispanic students, 30% white students, and 25% Black students, I made up those percentages real quick. I hope it equals 100, but something like that. And 60% of your responses are from white students, throw it out. It's not accurate, and it's not going to reflect your student needs. Again, that kind of gives you that same narrow viewpoint that if I only decide what I'm going to do based off of what I think my students need, that is essentially using needs assessment data that doesn't reflect your diverse population is the same thing as having someone with a very narrow viewpoint decide your whole school counseling program. So keep that in mind. It can be supplemental. You can do them. You're not going to get in trouble for doing them. They're not wrong. I still use them, but just using them with caution. That's all I would say. Okay. All right. This is my favorite part of this presentation. So I hope that you're bearing with us. I know this one is long. I knew it would be, because there is a lot to cover when it comes to data. And like I said, we're still just scratching the surface. So just keep that in mind. All right, so let's talk about some specifics of data. These are just some other things I want you to think about as we talk about what data collection looks like in our school counseling programs. So this Big Five, I don't know if you've ever heard of this before, but the Big Five is data that includes the location, time of day, student name, type of infraction, and grade level of a discipline referral. This to me is like the most basic data that must be collected when we're looking at discipline referrals. If we don't have these Big Five, we don't have a good picture of what has happened. But this Big Five can be really, really helpful, because data teams within your schools can look at this information and share it with staff pretty easily. You can graph this information pretty easily. So for example, at a school I was at once a month at staff meetings, we had a quick data share out, and we would often look at the location piece of this Big Five, because it never failed. There was one location in the school that had a lot more discipline referrals. So then we could talk about what we needed to do to address that. So this Big Five quickly identifies those red flags, like I said, such as location, so that you can really support that need. This data can drive the interventions that are put in place throughout the school. I love using this. I think it's pretty obvious, but sometimes we forget. This would be a great thing to advocate for if you don't feel like your school has a good discipline referral collection process. At least advocate to get these 5 things collected each time there's a discipline referral and you've got a place to start. Also, when we talk about data, we have to talk about the importance of disaggregating that data. That is when we really look into different variables of the data. So we start separating the data into groups of students who are not performing as well as others. So we look at what type of factors are affecting the outcomes. So what categories have more discipline referrals, have lower attendance, have lower achievement scores, those types of things. So when we think about disaggregating data, we want to look at these types of categories: gender, race and ethnicity, free or reduced lunch, course enrollment, language spoken at home, special education, gifted and talented, special ed, grade level, teacher, type of referrals. That one is so important. And then we also want to disaggregate even further: type of referrals based on gender, type of referrals based on race. That's when we start seeing things like dress code violations for Black students more than white students. Okay, what's the problem here? It doesn't sound like a student problem to me. It sounds like an adult problem. So that disaggregation can really help us dig into what the root of the problem is, which brings me to root cause analysis. I absolutely love this. If you're not familiar with root cause analysis, it sounds fancy, but it's just a procedure used to identify what happened, how it happened, and why it happened. And if we're looking at data but not considering this, we're really missing a big piece of the puzzle. Because when we look at the root cause analysis, then it categorizes our problems into 3 reasons: a physical condition, a human condition, or an organizational condition. So I love that this allows us to identify the root cause, because then we can work towards fixing it. When we don't identify the root cause, again, we're spinning our wheels. I think I have an example here. Yeah. So if a student is disciplined for inappropriate behavior on the bus, and we put a student level intervention like a discipline referral in place, but the school team does not consider possible bus overcrowding for underserved students a systems level problem, or bus procedures that were not well enforced a staff level problem, the student level intervention will not likely be effective. Right, I'm going to repeat that again because I think it's so important. Schools so often assume it's a student level problem. So they put a student level intervention in place. But if a student gets a behavior referral on a bus for inappropriate behavior, but we don't ever pause to look at how many students are on that bus, if there is enough adult supervision, if the bus picks up our students at 5 a.m. and they're on that bus for 3 hours because it goes, winds all over our town to pick up students everywhere. All these other, what might be systems level problems, or what might be a staff level problem, not well enforced procedures, or a bus driver who has not formed a relationship with the students, or a bus driver who just yells when they're upset, or whatever it may be. If we're not considering those root causes, our intervention's not going to work. It's not going to make a difference because that's not the problem. So our solution won't work. So when we think about a root cause analysis, we want to make sure we include each step of the process. So the first is to identify the problem. Then we'll collect that data. Then we can identify the possible factors. So again, going through that list and looking at what might be causing this this problem to occur. And then that will help us, that will lead us to identifying those root causes. And then we can recommend interventions and solutions that fit the problem. If we skip all those other steps and just start recommending interventions and solutions, we aren't addressing the true problem. Right, the next thing I wanted to speak on is what is called equity risk ratios. Again, if this is something you're not familiar with, don't let it be overwhelming. This is probably something you're doing. Maybe you just don't call it that. But equity risk ratio data measures the risk of a certain event happening in one group compared to the risk of the same event happening in another group. So I like to think of equity risk ratios as preventative data. It helps us look at the possibility of a certain event happening, and we can put interventions in place before the event happens in order to hopefully prevent it from occurring in the first place. So when we calculate a equity risk ratio, when we calculate that data, then us as school counselors and data teams can identify those groups of students who might be more likely to receive an office referral or be chronically absent, that sort of thing. So for an example here, it says that suppose an equity risk ratio determines that Hispanic and Black students are more likely to receive an office referral than their white peers. So we've looked at our data, we see that that is more likely to happen. Then what we can do in a preventative way is we can put a staff intervention in place. So maybe we need to address staff that are imposing white middle-class values on their discipline practices. Or maybe we need to provide professional development on equity or on appropriate discipline or restorative practices or culturally sustaining principles or cultural awareness, all those different topics that might be missing from that educator's professional development understanding. Then we can put that in place to address that risk, that potential equity risk that we gathered through the data. Oh, one more thing on this one. Let me go back to that real quick. This, again, just like our root cause analysis, is understanding that the problem is not always a student level problem. There are often times that there is a systems level or a staff level problem in place that we need to put an intervention in place for. And if we're always jumping to a student intervention, again, we're really missing a big and important piece of it. All right, so we talked about the big five. We talked about disaggregating our data, looking at that root cause analysis and the equity risk ratios. And that can seem like a lot, but what I love about each of those is that we can use them together to get a complete picture of the problems occurring in our school. So this really helps us to gain such a better perspective of what is happening in our schools than if all we do is run a report of discipline referrals, that we don't look at where the location was, or who the population was, or what the root cause was, or what type of equity risk ratio was in place. If we don't do all of that, we're not going to be able to really effectively address the problem. So together, these can help us get a really, really complete picture. Now, it might seem overwhelming to have to sift through all these different data sources, all these different things, but you're not alone in this. This is not just the school counselor's job. You are well equipped to be a member of data teams and a member of MTSS teams or PBIS teams or whatever is in place in your school. But there should be a team of educators looking at this data. And if there's not, you're in the perfect position to advocate for that. Once you have a good understanding of it, then you can advocate for that, bringing other educators together so that we are all better equipped to provide equitable and effective student services. All right, now let's dive into that school data summary. So this is the component of today's webinar that is in the national model. So the school data summary is a guide just really for us to review our school data. That's simple. It is a template provided by ASCA that we'll look at here in just a second that helps us to establish our annual school counseling priorities by sifting through that data. So the template asks 6 questions. You can see them listed here, and we'll look at them on the template in just 1 minute. The school data summary is really a great starting point for setting these priorities. It can help us, like I said, how the data really connects these other pieces because it can help us create our student outcome goals. It helps us select which mindsets and behaviors we want to address. It really helps us to start wrapping our head around our student and school needs. And also you'll see there that this can link to the school's mission because we want to make sure our school counseling program is aligned with our school mission, just like we talked about in our beliefs, vision, and mission webinar. So let's take a look at that template. Just as a reminder, the template can be found on ASCA's website, just like all of them. And this template is really just used to start creating your school's data story by reviewing all of that data you already have and looking at what you need to do moving forward. So let's take a look at that. I'm going to stop sharing for just 1 second and see if I can pull up that school data summary. Here it is. All right, so you'll see here, again, you don't have to reinvent this. This template is already created, and it just asks you some really good reflection questions and questions that help you get the ball rolling in your data collection for your school. What I recommend is that if you start to fill out this school data summary and you find that you don't know a lot of the answers, maybe this isn't information that your administrators have shared with you, then sit down with your school administrator and start working on this together. They might be able to share some really helpful pieces that you may not already know. And if you don't already know, you need to know. So it's a helpful way to start getting that conversation going. You can see here, it's really, like I said, just a reflection of identifying who in the building is aware of data, who's the data expert, who can help you interpret that data, what are the school improvement goals, what data reports from previous years, what do those show? What trends are you seeing? Again, in those 3 areas of achievement, attendance, and discipline. Comparing the school data with district and state data, that's really important. Sometimes when we're working in isolation, we don't know if our data is good, bad, somewhere in between. We need something to compare it to, so that can be really helpful. And then just here, this last question just allows you to prioritize those data points and start thinking about what you're going to do to address that data point. This will tie in beautifully when you start looking at those action plans, because that's when we really start putting in place what we're going to do to address specific data. What are our actions as school counselors? All right, so that's it. That's the school data summary template. Like I said, super easy to use, not hard to fill out. But like I said, if you don't have that information easily accessible, get with your administrator. I also find that that's a good way to start the conversation because you have this template in front of you and you can start talking about those things that maybe you haven't before. Right, implementation steps. So when we think about implementing data, like I said, I want you to remember that data really does touch on all aspects of comprehensive school counseling. So it is really ongoing. It is not a standalone activity. But if we want to put it into steps, we can look at these for 3 steps, I believe. Yeah, 3 steps. So first, school counselors identify that achievement, attendance, and discipline data and those opportunity and resource gaps. So we want to identify the gaps first, and then we can start collecting and analyze that data to identify areas of success among different groups. So this list gives you some really great things to start thinking through as you collect and analyze that data. Then, of course, we want to review, disaggregate, and interpret that student achievement, attendance, and discipline data. Again, giving you some specific action items to help you through that process. So, as you reflect on the data that you have collected, I encourage you to ask these questions either to yourself or to your data team, would be even better, or with your administrator. But as you foster growth around data, think, what data revealed specific needs and or gaps in your school? What other data is needed to more fully understand your students' needs? And how can you more easily access and track data in your school? So thinking through those as you think about strengthening your data collection and your data-informed school counseling program. So in summary, as we wrap up, just always like to remind you that we will collect, analyze, review data. We'll make our decisions based on data, but then we're going to repeat. Data collection is ongoing. So when I thought about writing a step-by-step summary for this one, I thought, well, there's really not a step-by-step summary for data, because we are always, it's an ongoing process. We're either collecting, analyzing, reviewing, making decisions, and then we're starting over, right? We are in that constant ongoing data collection mode so that we're doing what's best for kids. But as a reminder, we don't want perfect to be the enemy of good. So if we feel overwhelmed by the ongoing data collection, start small. Pick one piece. Like I said, you're already doing that participation data. So check, you've done that. Continue doing that. If you haven't been keeping that somewhere or graphing that or publicizing that, you can add that piece. But otherwise, just pick a place to start small. Maybe that means reviewing data from last year before the next school year begins. Maybe that's a place you can start small, just looking at what previous data looked like. Or maybe starting small for you is collecting data on just one small group. Maybe you want to do mindsets and behaviors data for just one group of 5 students. That might be a small step to start. Or maybe for you, starting small means enrolling in the ASCA U course about becoming a data specialist. That's a great first step, because it is okay to feel overwhelmed by this. It can be overwhelming, but I encourage you to start, because the scariest step is the first one. So once we get going, we realize it's not all that hard, and boy, is it exciting to see. Maybe it's the dork in me, but I love seeing the data. I love being able to show others what happened as a result of my school counseling program. And it just gets easier and easier the more you do it. So we want to consistently review that school data to reveal trends. We want to consistently use that data to determine if our school counseling program strategies, interventions, and activities are effective. And we want to remember that this is never a check mark. We're always looking at that school data and the data as a result of our school counseling program, and continuing to grow and strengthen and continuing to do what's best for our students. And as long as we do that, we know we're on the right track, and we know that that will lead us to the right decision. As always, thank you for joining me. I know this one was a lot, and so I hope you take a little break, go get a refill of your coffee or do a stretching break. But thank you for joining me. Please reach out if you have any questions at all. I'm more than happy to help. I know data collection can seem overwhelming, but it's so important, and it truly touches everything we do as school counselors. Thank you for your work to serve students, and I will see you again soon. Bye.